Good evening. I'm going to talk briefly about the Black experience in World War II. I actually thought as I was working on preparation for this that there's a lot you probably already know and that you've probably already taught. And I'm going to just give a quick overview. I have some slides that I think will be useful, images that you probably have already used in your classrooms, but also just make some other recommendations of sources and ways to approach your teaching of this subject. Most of what you have in your teach, you have to teach the war experience, not necessarily too many questions about the war, except for the desegregation of the armed forces, which we will look at a document in our breakout session on that. So I'm not going to cover that into detail, but we can discuss it after you've had a chance to look at it. But I also want to talk about just what does it mean and what was happening at the time. So most of what I'm doing here is giving you the context that will help you with the ways you can bring this into your classroom. Next slide, please. So one of the main terms that you guys probably have heard about is that the war was the WV campaign. This was a campaign that you heard about because African Americans were fighting for victories abroad, but they were also fighting for victories at home. And they struggled with that because they were not treated well, as you know. This goes back to the racial climate and the experiences that were happening after World War One. So you have African Americans serving in World War One, coming back, being segregated or not allowed to participate in some of the parades that happened after the war, also experiencing high levels of lynching and racial violence and discrimination as part of Jim Crow and segregation that was happening in the early 20th century. That actually continues up through World War II. And African Americans are wanting to go fight in the war, participate in the war, and they're wondering, why am I looking for a victory abroad when I'm going to come home and be treated poorly? And so they actually came into this hoping that they would be treated fairly, that they would receive the kind of respect that they didn't receive in World War One. And these are just a few of the newspaper ads that talked about this whole double V campaign, and Black people uniting over this issue. Next slide, please. I think one of the things that you can use in your classroom to talk about this are political ads and cartoons that I think are very vivid. It gives you a good sense of the popular culture or the press culture of the time. And so here you see, look at the issue of here's an African American soldier that's producing weaponry for the war, but not able to really be a full citizen because of racial prejudice and segregation. On your right, he's being pulled down by that. Then you also have this whole idea of the NAACP and Jim Crow. You see the swastika here, and so there's this whole discussion about all the different contradictions. And I really do think, like Dr. Brown mentioned earlier, that some of the contradictions that we saw back then are some of the things that people are talking about today. It's just about having equal treatment in society and in the military. We are seeing that some of that discrimination still continues. Next slide, please. Here's a great article that I think would be useful that talks about this. This shows one of the parades in 1942. This was in New York, on Malcolm X and Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard. That is significant because Adam Clayton Powell was very, very active at this time as well. He tried to lead the March on Washington movement, but he was actually one of the starting members to lead the March on Washington movement. And I'm referring to that as a movement because there were multiple marches on Washington, not just the march that King led in the late 60s. So here's that they want to fight for freedom, and they want to fight for freedom not just abroad, but also at home. It shows you how widespread this campaign was, how widespread it was within the Black community, and the kind of support that they were getting throughout the United States. And it was also challenging our country to look and recognize at the contradictions of the ways in which African Americans were being treated. So they had, before legislation changed, before they changed with the desegregation of the military, African Americans could not move up into outside of enlistee status. They, as you know, we'll talk about somebody, Dory Miller, in a minute. But they couldn't really move into the ranks, and they couldn't. And so that was one of the other challenges that they thought, why can't we fight the same way? This changes though in the middle of the war, mid-course, and that changes, and that allows for African Americans in the Navy, African Americans and flying with the Tuskegee Airmen. So we'll see that shortly. Next slide, please. So here's Here's another, just an ad. It's a little bit later, but Black men should not fight in Vietnam for racist USA. Just showing you like, how are you going to use your activism to make a statement about what's happening? You're going to be enlisted into the military, but how can you fight against that? Next slide, please. Here's now, we have executive order. There's a couple executive orders. You're going to look at one of them in your breakout section, but this is how you wipe out, this is when Truman wipes out segregation in the armed forces. There are, I mean, a number of documents, a number of websites that are dedicated just to Blacks in the World War One. There's one at University of Kentucky that has some really good resources that I think you would like. There's also the new 2-minute history series, or Black History in 2 Minutes by Henry Louis Gates. He's got a great 2-minute segment on Blacks in World War II. That I think is a wonderful resource that you can bring into your classroom. But there's also ones that have a number of these documents. If you want to have your students look at various documents in class as part of your effort to teach them in a variety of different ways outside of just the textbooks that you might be using. Next slide, please. This is just an image of the desegregated troops that you're now seeing. Before, you wouldn't see bunkers where they would have mixed race, where you have African Americans, Asian Americans, Mexican Americans, white Americans, all in the same space. So this is an image that shows that. And it's also, to me, I like this image because it's showing that it's not like it doesn't look like it's forced here. It doesn't look like, I mean, we don't know how everybody felt, but it doesn't look like they don't want to stand next to each other. So I think there's a level of support here that can be conveyed in this image. Next slide, please. And that leads us to a Texan. And the reason why I wanted to talk about Dory Miller was that he's from Waco. And that's a great way to connect with your students. I find that when you, and I've said this in other workshops, but when you find ways to connect with your students about places in their community or people from their community, or if there's no connection to Texas or your community, maybe connect with somebody of the same age that did something courageous in history or something in history that you're talking about. That's a great way to get your students engaged. So like I was mentioning earlier, Dory Miller was not able to have the same level. He was working in the laundry. Or a mess man, they called him. And during Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor, he saw that the captain was injured, and he ran and knocked down a number of planes. I think it was 7 total. Don't quote me on that. But anyways, he grabbed a hold of the weaponry and shot down a number of airplanes and literally saved the ship. And so that was an example of why it was important to allow African Americans the ability to fight. Next slide, please. These are some other images of him, the hero of Pearl Harbor. He was often hidden from history books for a long time, and his name was not mentioned. And now he's getting, I would say in the last maybe 10 years, he's received much more attention. They've done, there's a number of, as here in Austin where we are, they have community centers named after him. There's other places, streets, and other buildings named after him throughout the state of Texas. You see that there was a stamp for him as well. Next slide, please. This is him getting honored for his bravery above and beyond the call of duty. Next slide, please. And that leads us to the Tuskegee Airmen. And what I like about this as well, this is another way of showing, when we look at African-American history in general, and I've said this before, it's often a story of great obstacles. There are lots of triumphs along the way, but the story overall sometimes can be difficult for students to get through. So it's nice to find moments like the history of the Tuskegee Airmen to share with students, to show that Black people were not just fighting against lynching, fighting against slavery, fighting against mass incarceration, that you actually see African Americans contributing in ways that may not have been listed in the books that you're teaching or even on the standards that are in the test. So the Tuskegee Airmen is an excellent group. This is a photograph of them here. Next slide, please. Let's have a few images of them, and then we're going to move into this. I think is good because it shows there's some action photos here. They're also showing that there's a large number. It's showing that they're making plans, they're thinking things out. Some of these are staged photographs, but I still think it's important for imagery, particularly because the other image that you were seeing at this time of African Americans were African Americans being lynched. Public newspaper clippings, articles with crowds and crowds of people showing African American lynch victims, people burned at the stake. So this is a really important contrast to that. Next slide, please. And here I like this because it's showing all the different battles that the Tuskegee Airmen were participating in, and it shows the red stars here, the location of their missions. And I think people don't understand that, the significance of the reach of all the different places that they were fighting for our country. And when you see this and you look at this, you recognize the contributions that they made were significant. And I think this is a really great visual to show that. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, and then I'll be back with you all in a little bit. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so now we want to add a little context, or add a little bit of meat around race to these constructs, to the presentation that Dr. Berry has already given. We're going to share what we have identified as key frameworks to understand race, right? So these are ideas that have been theorized that help us to better understand how race operates in our society. And we've, each week has been nice because we've been able to identify and target specific frameworks that we think will be important if you're going to talk about race. Next slide, please. So we always start any conversation that we have about race and racism with this idea around the social construction of race. And this is important to understand because for many of our students, the assumption is that race is just something that you are. You're born in the world with a race. But what we know is that race is an idea that has been constructed over time. And it's constructed over time through a variety of different kinds of practices. And this is always really interesting and fun to talk to students to help them sort of unpack what are some ways that we understand race. We understand race through scientific practices that were put in place, scientists that were attempting to show or try to illuminate that there are racial differences. We had laws that were in place that prohibited people from doing certain things based on their race. We have policies that were put in place that helped us to understand race. Policies on immigration, policy, who could be a citizen, all of those kinds of things were racialized. Popular culture, film, advertisements, television, these are all sort of places where we see race operating. And then it's also in the everyday practices, how we treat one another, how we engage one another, and the stories that we tell about each other. Those are all ways that our society uses to affix a racial meaning. Next slide, please. But even though race is socially constructed, it's really important that our students understand and that we understand that those social constructions are powerful. And there are real material consequences that are linked to those constructions. And we're going to talk about a really important and powerful way that race operated as it was a social construct that had material consequences that we're still dealing with today in terms of wealth and the distribution of wealth in our society, and how that's how that is connected to how we have addressed and not addressed issues of race in the US. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in our presentation. But for now, it's important that if we talk about the social construction of race, we also talk about the fact there's materiality that's linked to those social constructions. Next slide, please. So we're identifying 3 specific forms of racism if we think about racism, what are the ways that racism can get leveraged within our society? And we're arguing that there's interpersonal racism, structural institutional racism, and then internalized racism. For our conversation today, the two green, the kind of I guess we would call those. I can't even think of the right word. It's not a mint green, but the sort of darker green color circles represent the type of racism that we believe operated in the histories of Black Americans during the World War II time period. Interpersonal racism is simply racism that happens between two people or between a person and a group. It's at the local level, and it's what we would consider a micro form of racism. There's also internalized racism, which is racism that individuals take on. Often those who are the victims or the targets of racism, they themselves can sometimes begin to believe racist ideas and engage in practices that are internalized, internally racist, right? So they sort of embody these larger societal racist ideas. And then finally, there's structural and institutional racism. And here we're talking about racism that gets embedded in the actual practices and structures of our society. And today we'll talk about how these institutionalized forms of racism played out in our housing practices in the US. And we'll also think about it at the level of citizenship, which is a really important idea when we're thinking about this particular time period and Black people. And Dr. Brown will discuss that now. Next slide, please.
So, in situating the story of the Double V campaign around these ideas of race and citizenship, it's important to consider that there was pre-war optimism. The idea that African Americans, that even you could even see this in World War II, this idea that if you fight for your country and die for your country, the tacit agreement is that you should gain some access to whatever society has for you. I mean, we could even see that notion of civitas in Greek antiquity, that through death and sacrifice comes a certain level of integration into society, and maybe even placing you on a pedestal of some sort. So African Americans, so part of the Double V campaign was a certain level of racial optimism, a kind of optimism that you could see in some of the documents in the Crisis and others, in which there's a tension among African Americans. There's optimistic perspectives that America will live up to its highest ideals, and there's a pessimistic perspective that suggests that America is already entrenched in particular perspectives, and the outcomes that are attached to this kind of, if we think of the social contract, the social contract is not a breach of that contract. The contract itself is your existence. So so it's important that we think about the Double V campaign as largely part of that sense of optimism. Post-war, after World War II, however, is a theory that I want us to explore a little bit, is this idea of racial realism. Please, if you could go to the next slide. So if you have here in this message, in this visual, you have racial optimism, the idea that America will live up to its highest ideals. Think of the left as the social contract. And then on the right, you have this idea of racial reality, or what we'll call racial realism. And these ideas compete over history, and it even exists to this day, that will America ever live up to its highest ideals, or will its reality be always tied to this binary of black and white, at black on the bottom, white on top, and any other group in between? So this idea I'll explore a little bit further as it relates to what exactly is the contract itself. But the idea of racial optimism and racial reality are tied together. If we could go to the next slide. So again, as I stated before, there are two competing philosophical beliefs as they deal with race. The first is this idea that there is a social contract. You could see it in King's speech where he talks about a dream and that there was a check and that check had insufficient funds, meaning that Americans had fought and built this country economically or through their active participation in the military. Yet, in that context, African Americans were not given the same access to opportunities are made available to them. That's one position that one could take to it. And I would even argue that most of the rhetoric of the civil rights movement is predicated on this idea of a broken social contract. The other is a different perspective that we want to present is the idea of a racial contract. What suggests is that the contract itself was based on the binary of placing African Americans on the bottom. So the idea that to die and to work for your country and then to not gain the spoils for philosophers like Charles Mills is the contract itself. It's not a broken contract, but the contract itself is established on the idea that being on the bottom is not by accident. It's anchored in place and held in place for the very purpose to sustain this kind of hierarchy, racial hierarchy. You go to the next slide, please. So here we provide a little bit more visual, and Dr. Brown, please, if you want to jump in at some point after this, and articulate these three parts to the U.S. racial contract.
Okay, so if we think about the US racial contract, right? If we live in a society, there's a social contract that implicitly sort of lays out how individuals are supposed to interact and engage with one another, and how their country will also engage with them. The US racial contract argues that there are other kinds of practices that are taking place that are racialized that exist alongside that social contract. Now, what's important about this is first that racial contract is applied only to particular citizens, right? And so it's not everyone who is impacted by a racial contract. It's specific people. And if we go back to that earlier idea around the social construction of race, we sort of understand that there's a socially constructed idea about race. And there's, if you could go back, please. Thank you. You don't have to go back to that. I'm sorry. I said go back. I meant no. You can stay on that slide. When I said go back, I meant, I was just referring to an earlier slide. You don't have to go back to it. Thank you, Liz. That earlier slide that talked about the social construction of race gives us some insight into how race gets constructed, but there are material consequences. And this US racial contract is one of those sort of material effects of the social contract. So it's applied to particular citizens, and these citizens are in this case, Black citizens. So what this basically means is that, you know, in normal circumstances, it might not be appropriate to treat someone unfairly for their skin color. But in the case of Black people, they could be, right? The social contract it did not belong to them, right? And when these decisions are made, these are sort of implicit. They operate covertly and implicitly. In some cases, it might be written in law, but then when it's not written in law, it's still there. And often people are willing to, the dominant society is willing to sort of embrace it because it appeals to dominant notions of common sense, right? And so when we talk about the housing discrimination and redlining, many of the arguments that were made for engaging in those practices appeal to people's common sense, which we'll come back to in just a moment. I want to make sure that we come back to this racial contract to show how you can apply it to this example. Next slide, please.
And I just want to add, it's not intended to be abstract. It's as simple as if you had a contract to do a job, and in that job there were certain outcomes. You were supposed to make $500, $400, whatever that contract is. What, again, a check marked insufficient funds is King's analogy. For the racial contract thesis is to say the check marked insufficient funds is the contract itself. You work as much or more than I guess your white counterpart, but you gain nothing from that exchange, and that goes against this idea of meritocracy that I know Dr. Brown talks quite a bit about in her work.
Okay, so we can go to the next slide and we'll watch, we're gonna watch a film, a little bit of a clip. It's about a little under 5 minutes. It's from a film entitled Race, the Power of an Illusion, which sort of gives an overview and a history of race in the US and how it played a foundational role in the earliest beginnings of the country all the way to the present. The clip that we're going to look at talks about a particular moment post World War II, where we see racial discrimination play out in the form of housing. Okay.
Thank you, Liz. You could go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that I know are short on time because we want to give you an opportunity to look at the documents, but there are a couple of things that we want you to consider. I mean, it's a point that Dr. Berry made, is this idea is as close as pedagogically, if we can make our linkages to these questions as close to home as possible. Oftentimes we don't make those connections to places like Austin. We recently gave a series of lectures of professional development around the teaching of enslaved Africans. And then part of that process was to show runaway ads right here in Austin, in Travis County. And that does something to you to know that the where we walk and where we reside had those real material consequences. So here's a visual of what Dr. Brown and I articulated as the racial contract. So this is not an outcome of just a few bad realtors or a few bad bankers that had kind of corrupt perspectives about loans. This was institutionalized. And one of the things you automatically notice is like the grade of the East Side was hazardous. And if you understand this idea of hazardous, this is not just a one-shot thing. This is like what Dr. Brown stated earlier, that there are a confluence of kind of racial meaning that's hurled at African Americans. They're naturally not capable of being able to think and reason, and the theologians have some logic behind that. The scientists engage the conversation, the social scientists, the medical field engages question. So the realtors are merely drawing on an ideology that was already there. They
And
weren't.
can I
Yeah, go
can I
ahead,
throw,
Dr. Brown.
I'll just jump in. If we think back to that the image that we showed earlier around the racial contract, the idea that it targets specific people, right? And that it is implicit. This contract is implicit. When you look at this, there's nothing you see about race. There's nothing that it doesn't say anything about race. But if you know who lives in those areas that are red at the time, and this we didn't give you're going to get an opportunity to look more closely at this image in a few moments in your small groups. This is a map that was produced around, I think it was 1945 to 1950. We're not sure the specific time, but it's during the New Deal here in Austin. If you know where people lived, and there'll be another document that you're going to look at, then this is totally racialized, right? But that contract, right? And it's okay. It's okay for this particular part of town to be positioned in a way that doesn't allow for loans or for people to get loans to buy their homes, or simply because of the way that it has been marked. And it's marked this way because there are Black people who live in those communities, right? And so this is a way to sort of think about how the racial contract operates.
And just to add, it's race itself is a fiction or a fabrication, The real material consequences are this, and let me just add something to this. It's not just simply the grading or the category of hazardous that's the material. It's that of the $120 billion worth of new housing subsidized by the government from 1934 to 1962, less than 2% went to non-white families. Non-whites were locked out of the home ownership just as most whites were finally getting in. So you see growth in one and depreciation in another. And that is part of that racial meaning. So it's important for us to understand racial materialism, not just simply as a few random acts of access that were left out. They were widely institutionalized and had long term implications that we're dealing with and inheriting here in the present.
And still, and citizenship. This happened to people who had fought for their country, who thought that they would be able to be a part of that larger democratic project. And so we have notions of citizenship that are made that are troubled during this history as well. So I guess it might be time for us to go ahead and get into the small groups.